Thanks everyone for attending. My name is Jenny. I'm from BenQ Australia. Today we have Jeremy with us from Image Science, who's going to help us talk about calibration for photography and print. To get this webinar going, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and I will unmute you and then you can ask Jeremy the question.
Yep. Is it worth pointing out that raising your hand is that an action that you do in the software? I mean, we can't see people, so
yeah. So it's actually in Zoom. So if you click more, and you can raise your hand, and then I can see it, and I will help you. And if you have any questions, you can also put it in the Q&A, and we can help you from there. Okay.
Sounds good. Okay, well, Jenny, did you want to start off by talking about that big, beautiful monitor next to you? And then because I'm using that exact monitor, but it's because of the way the camera is oriented here and whatnot, it's not going to be easy to see that. But that is the exact monitor I am using tonight for the demonstration. Yeah.
So this is our brand new flagship monitor, the BenQ SW321C. It's 99% Adobe Rgb hardware calibrated, and it is Pantone and Kalman verified. So that means that you are ensured to have accurate colors when you are working on your photography stuff. What else is there that it's?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's several remarkable features, I guess, or new and exciting features. One is that it is fully USB-C, including charging back to the laptop. So particularly for MacBook owners, but also for quite a lot of modern PCs now, you can really hook it up with a single cord, and that is a single cord that displays the video, transmits audio, transmits data, and also transmits power back to the laptop. So you literally have this lovely one cord setup, which, given I live in an absolute cord jungle, I find a very attractive feature of this monitor. And I think the other thing that's really particularly interesting about this model is it has a really excellent, for the first time I think, from BenQ, a really excellent anti-glare screen coating. So it is uncannily matte. There is no reflection really from it at all, and that in particular, as we'll talk about some aspects of calibration to do with print, but that is a particularly nice aspect of this monitor when you are trying to get it to simulate paper. Paper is inherent. Well, it's generally not a particularly glossy medium unless you're choosing a high gloss material, and most of the action in modern fine art print is in the area of matte fine art papers, and having your monitor fundamentally look more like paper is considerably improved when the monitor is very matte in its surface appearance, and this monitor has an excellent matte coating. So that's a really nice development, because some of the previous models I have said, look, it's great, but it is just that little bit too glossy still for my taste, and it's really nice to see that improvement from BenQ. Now, one thing worth noting is that Jenny isn't the biggest person in the world, but you can see just how big this monitor is when you have Jenny next to it. The monitor is truly huge, and it does mean that you get this unusually spectacular view on your imagery. It is not always the case that bigger is better, but when it comes to monitors, it certainly doesn't hurt, and particularly if you are using your monitor not just as a work tool, but as a presentation device. So if you're working in any aspect of commercial photography where you're actually showing images to clients, well, it doesn't need to be photography, but any commercial imaging role, this monitor has more wow factor than really pretty much any monitor you can think of. It is big and very beautiful. Anyway, that's enough about the monitor. Let's move on to talking about calibration. Oh, Ivy's come along. And the other piece of hardware that we're going to be using tonight, that I will just show you, if you can all see that, that is an Iowan Display Pro Calibrator. That's a truly remarkable device, to be honest. It has been the industry standard professional calibrator for 8 years now, which, in electronics terms is a truly remarkable lifespan. They have recently released a new version, the Iowan Display Pro Plus, and I'm just hanging that back on my monitor. The Iowan Display Pro Plus, to be honest, that doesn't really add much for most people. It is particularly geared at the home entertainment market, so particularly people who want to calibrate things like OLEDs. We have a lot of customers also who are professional video editors, and they're often using an OLED panel to, as what's called a reference panel, where they are essentially using that panel to simulate, you know, what their customers, their viewers will actually see. So what people with OLEDs at home, or what, you know, more like what you would see in a movie theater. And because those panels have incredible contrast, far more contrast than any desktop monitor, Xrite have come along and developed a calibrator that can deal with that extra contrast. But in the context of desktop monitors, the standard Iowan Display Pro calibrator is really all you need. And quite frankly, you know, compared to all the other calibrators, the Iowan Display Pro is really the obvious choice. It's significantly better than the Spiders, and it is actually cheaper than the more expensive Spider models. So it, to me, is the obvious choice, and it has been a reliable and trusted friend for more than 8 years now. So it makes a great match to a BenQ monitor. Okay. So that covers the hardware that we're using, and before we embark on our demonstration. But it is worth briefly talking about why we calibrate. I won't spend a huge amount of time on this because I imagine that most people attending a lecture or a webinar on calibrating monitors don't need to be convinced that it is worthwhile calibrating your monitor. You know, to me, it's obvious. You cannot work on quality imagery without calibration. You cannot be sure that what you're seeing on your screen, and that's true even of fantastic screens like these BenQs, you cannot be sure that what you're seeing is accurate unless you calibrate. Now, in the context of really great monitors, calibration is very often more about not the gross correction that we might experience if we're using low quality monitors. It's simply about quality assurance. It's about very, very minor adjustments just to take monitor from good to perfect. And it is about making sure that your color is accurate, that nothing has shifted unexpectedly or something isn't going wrong. So, you know, it is an essential part of the modern imaging workflow. The other thing that, you know, calibration is all about is that monitors drift. You know, a monitor is a device that is essentially at its heart fairly simple. You know, if you think of it as a group of lights and some filters in front of those lights. Now, those lights these days are normally LED backlights. The entire BenQ range, it's all LED at this point. And they are fairly stable, but they're not perfectly stable. They do change behavior over time. So monitor calibration is something that becomes increasingly important the longer you own a monitor, as monitors drift, and they drift through use. So the more you use them, the more they tend to change their behavior. And so calibration over time becomes more and more important because it helps bring the monitor back to its correct display. So, you know, that is just a really quick overview of why calibration is important. But as I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to convince you on that, because I presume, given that you're here, that you're already fairly convinced that calibration is a necessary process. I will say calibration, it's fundamentally boring. So what you really want from a calibration system is something that is easy to use and gets out of your way and gets the job done. The best calibration systems are direct hardware calibration systems. So that's where the monitor has a bunch of hardware in it to directly support calibration, and the BenQ SW range support that direct hardware calibration process. What that means is, in practice, we are going to measure the monitor's color, and then any corrections that are required to that color will go into the monitor itself. The monitor has very high quality hardware to do those very subtle corrections that will be needed to make the monitor's display accurate. This is a better approach than the traditional way of calibrating, which is called software calibration. So if you have a more typical desktop monitor, like a Dell desktop monitor or some crappy Apple screen or something like that, and you calibrate it, what's actually happening is the monitor's color is being measured and corrections are being calculated, but there's nowhere in the monitor to store those corrections. They are in fact stored in the video card. And unfortunately, video cards only have relatively crude hardware to support those corrections. So the finesse of adjustments that you can make is considerably reduced if you don't have a monitor that supports hardware calibration. Now, the very latest monitors from BenQ, including this SW321 beauty in front of us here, they have 16-bit lookup tables, which are currently the highest level of correction tables that are available. in monitors, and previous models have often 14-bit lookup tables and so forth. So still excellent quality lookup table systems. And basically that bit depth is just to give a quick explanation, is the higher the better. Essentially what it means is the more bit depth you have, the finer the adjustments you can make. In addition to having very high bit depth, so 16-bit lookup tables, they also have what are called three-dimensional lookup tables. And what that means in practice is, instead of just correcting a color in one dimension at a time, so making blue slightly more blue or something like that, it can take a color point and move it in all directions at once, in 3 dimensions. So in the red, the green, and the blue directions simultaneously. And again, what that just means is that you get considerably more finesse with the corrections that you can make, and the net result is more accurate color. So there's no question that the hardware in these monitors is really excellent, but let's now talk about the software and how we actually go about calibrating, and how we might vary that calibration depending on the particular context that you might be thinking about and that you might work with. All right, probably at this point I'll share my screen, and there we go. And hopefully now you can all see the Palette Master Element calibration software. So Palette Master Element is BenQ's software for their SW range of monitors, which obviously are their monitors that are geared towards professional photography and other graphic arts use. The software is very simple to use for these systems, which is great. It means you don't have to spend a lot of time worrying about complexity and knowing lots of different controls and so on. And it's worth saying that one of the other big advantages of direct hardware calibration is it tends to be a lot more automatic than software calibration. So back in the bad old days when you calibrated a monitor, you used to kind of have to go into the monitor menus, hit the buttons, bring up the brightness or bring up the red, green and blue, and make manual adjustments to those things while you were calibrating. That was tedious because it meant that you had to be sitting in front of the machine while you did it, and it was fiddly because very often it was hard. You would adjust the red, but that would throw out the blue, and then you'd adjust the blue and that would throw the red back out, and you'd end up doing this sort of awkward dance trying to get a good result. With these direct hardware calibration systems, they direct drive the monitor's hardware and they make exactly the adjustments that should be made all automatically in a sort of hands-off way. So one of the, I guess, undersold benefits of this type of calibration is that it's not only much higher quality, but it's much easier as well. And ease of use is, I just think it's a really important aspect to these things, because yeah, calibration is boring, it can be fiddly and technical, and the easier it is to do, the more often you're likely to do it, and therefore the more accurate your screen is going to stay. Okay, so you can see here on the software that it has identified the type of monitor that we're using, the type of calibration device that we're using. You can see a little green tick by that saying that it has identified the calibrator, and we're going to go straight into the advanced mode. I personally don't even know why there is a basic mode, because the advanced mode isn't that complicated anyway, and you want to take advantage of the stuff it can do. I'll be perfectly honest, I don't think I've ever actually hit start in the basic mode. I don't even know what it does in the basic mode, but in the advanced mode, this is what it does. Straight away, you have a choice between two options, profiling and validation. So profiling is where we're going to actually do the calibration, the adjustment side of the process, and improve the monitor's accuracy. Validation is if we want to check what the results of that process were. Down in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a little bit of technical information, the version of the application that we're using. We're using version 1.3.9 that was released literally a couple of days ago. BenQ are very good at doing updates. They flow through regularly. And the calibrator we're using is this Iowan Display Pro, also known as the Iowan Display version 3. We hit next to go to the next thing. Okay, this is really, in many ways, the key page of the whole experience, so I'll spend a little bit of time here. When you calibrate a monitor, what are you actually trying to do? That's a good question. I'm glad I asked. The reality is that you're often, there are competing goals in calibration, and you're often trying to do different things for different jobs. So I'll talk about the two main ones that come up. One is if you are the typical modern photographer who is simply sending their photos out electronically. You know, you take lots of photographs, you perhaps don't do a lot of printing, and you're sending your photographs via email or the web to other people just to have a look at. Perhaps you know, setting up online galleries for grandma. Or perhaps you're a commercial photographer shooting real estate and you're sending them off to you know, whoever does your website so that the listings can be updated. That's one goal of calibration. You want to have you want to calibrate then towards a set standard so that you know for sure that you are producing imagery that looks right in the majority of contexts to people who are going to be viewing your work on the screen. Another possibility is that you're much more interested in print, in which case you are really doing something quite different. You are then trying to make your monitor a predictor of your final output. And your final output is a piece of printed paper. Hopefully it's somewhere, you know, it's printed by a fine art lab or printed on your own properly color managed inkjet printer at home, and you're trying to produce the best possible match between what you see on screen and what you're going to get out of your printer later on. So we'll discuss both of those and the different settings that you might use for those two contexts. Okay, let's first discuss white point. White point is the color of white on your screen. D65 is a nice, safe, defensive choice a lot of the time. It is essentially the standard white point that pretty much every modern imaging device is aiming for. So, for example, your home television set is typically out of the box. Its preset modes are usually calibrated for 6500 Kelvin, also known as D65. They're not exactly the same thing, D65 and 6500 Kelvin, but that's way too technical to get into tonight. That is the standard white point for desktop monitors, for HD TVs, for really pretty much all sorts of modern display devices. So if you're just trying to calibrate your screen for that sort of electronic delivery scenario that I was talking about before, D65 is the obvious white point to use. On the other hand, if you are trying to simulate printed output, you will find that in general, D65 is too cool. It is too blue to give you an accurate simulation of fine art prints, of the prints that will actually come out of your printer. Papers just simply aren't that cool. Even kind of quite commercial papers are not that cool. So in that instance, what we do is we typically set a different white point. Now, there's no one specific white point, but around the office and in most fine art print labs, you will find that they tend to calibrate around the 5800 Kelvin mark, because that tends to provide a pretty good screen to print match in general between most prints on most papers that most people are using. You might want to go a little bit cooler than that, so a higher number if the papers that you're using are very, very blue, very sort of what we would call commercial. You might want to go yet colder, yet warmer than that, down towards 5500 or possibly even 5000 Kelvin if you really are using warm fine art papers. Now, if you know much about printer color management, you'll know that profiles are actually built for 5000 Kelvin, printer profiles. And for many people, that's a really hard thing to get their head around. They kind of go, well, I should make my screen 5000 Kelvin because my printer profile is 5000 Kelvin. And if I want the two to match, then I have to have that white point the same. That is not true. And the fundamental principle of color management is something known as the principle of chromatic adaptation. And what that really, in a short version, says is that the white point, it's not so important. You don't want any massive gross differences between your white points, but when trying to make things match, your white point doesn't need to be identical because your eye will automatically adjust to the different scenarios. Now, when talking about print, one of the most human things that we like to do is hold our prints next to our monitor. It's a very common mistake that people make, but it does not work, and it will never really work. The reality is that your eye will not cope comfortably with a printed image and a backlit version of that image at the same time. Color management in the print domain is built completely about what's called independent viewing events. By design, the idea is that you look at your prints under a light source, and you know, it's probably worth mentioning that the BenQ wit lamps are an excellent quality, reasonably inexpensive solution to print viewing. So you could have a lovely lamp like that, and you look at your prints under that lamp, and then you look at your screen, and you do those two things independently, and you don't need the white points to be identical between the two to produce a good visual match when you do that. And if you were to set your screen to 5000 Kelvin, you would find in general your screen is very warm and would look absurdly warm compared to most screens that you're used to using. Like if you looked at your phone screen and then back at your monitor would look positively yellow. So moving to a figure as low as 5000 Kelvin, while it's tempting, does tend to create more problems than it solves. So you will find that most people in practice have found that a figure in the mid 5000s is a good happy average for print work. Okay, Rgb Primaries. So this is where we're talking about the gamut or the range of colors that the monitor can display. Now, this monitor in its what's called native gamut, i.e. its unconstrained gamut, can display essentially Adobe Rgb gamut. Jenny, just to know, I can see the little thing popping up and down. I presume that's questions popping through, but I can't see those at the moment while I'm sharing my screen, so I'm not paying any attention to them. Please feel free to interrupt me if they seem relevant or open up people's microphones, because I'm quite happy to answer them as we go.
Okay. So we do have a question from Stan, who said that he's currently using Palette Master Element on SW270C, and after calibration, the software creates an ICC profile.
Yes.
As I understand, the calibration is through hardware. What does this ICC profile do? And if Windows loads this ICC profile, does it have any impact?
Yep, that's a great question. Really, it's what we call a null profile. It's a profile that explicitly tells Windows not to adjust the signal going to the monitor. So it is doing something. It's basically preventing anything else from adjusting the signal that's going to the monitor. So it's a necessary thing, and it's why we sort of say, if you have a hardware calibration monitor, yes, the calibration is stored in the monitor, but you should run the calibration process once on each computer that you connect to that monitor. So in theory, you can take a hardware calibrated monitor and then attach it to any computer, and it would stay calibrated. But the reality is that very often computers have default profiles installed that are modifying the signal going to the monitor, and we want to prevent that from happening. So the BenQ software essentially creates this null profile, shoves it into the right place, and tells the operating system, don't adjust the color going to the monitor because it's happening in hardware. But that's a great question. Thanks for asking it. Shall I carry on, Jenny, for the moment? Jenny's muted. Never mind. I will. Okay, Rgb Primaries. So this was the gamut. So this is the range of colors. Again, the physical gamut of these monitors is essentially Adobe Rgb, a relatively wide color space. Now, many of you will probably be familiar with Srgb, which is in some ways, it has many explanations over time, but it's probably fair to call it the internet's default color space. It is the color space that is assumed by default by most hardware and software if they're not very color management smart. So if, for example, all your delivery is over the web to other people and you don't know what hardware they have and whatnot, then ultimately delivering your files in Srgb is probably a sensible idea. And you might even go so far as saying, I'm going to calibrate my screen to that gamut. I'm going to constrain the displayable color on my screen to only that gamut, because really that's the only set of colors that I care about. It's the colors that I'm pretty sure everyone can see, and it's how I send out my imagery. So I'm just not going to worry if my photographs have those other colors in them. So you could choose Srgb there. As a color purist, that is slightly appalling to me, just because I believe that if your camera can capture those extra colors, and if your files can hold those colors, and if your monitor can display those colors, then you should probably do your edits in those colors and only convert into the smaller color space, even when you actually need to. So in general, with a monitor like these, for most scenarios, I suggest calibrating to the panel native gamut. It is worth noting, if this is what you're calibrating the monitor to, so you're calibrating it to panel native gamut, you're saying show all the color that the monitor is capable of displaying as accurately as you can. That does not mean if you then open an sRgb image on this monitor that it's going to incorrectly display those colors. You know, it knows that your image that you've chosen to open is in sRgb, and it will show you an sRgb image in sRgb colors, even though the potential gamut of the monitor is much wider than that. So it's quite possible to calibrate your monitor to the native gamut, but still effectively work in the narrower color spaces if you so choose to do so. There's no problem whatsoever with doing that. And people who first buy these wide gamut monitors, they're often worried that everything's going to look oversaturated and it's going to be a huge problem. In practice, it's not really, because in general, you're using color managed applications like Photoshop or Lightroom or Capture One, and those applications are smart enough to know that if you open an image in sRgb, it should be displayed as sRgb, and it shouldn't be showing those more saturated colors that are potentially in other images. So most of the time, I would say, even if you're doing electronic delivery to other people and whatnot, you might as well calibrate into the panel native gamut. Luminance is the next section, and it's probably the hardest one to talk about, because there is no absolute figure for luminance for monitors. And that is because your perception of your monitor's brightness depends fairly significantly on the light that surrounds your monitor. So for example, if you're in the habit of basically working in the Batcave, a completely dark environment, you like it, you know, really, really dark, as many graphic artists used to work in, then you will find that you need a lower luminance figure, or you're going to have some issues. You're going to have some comfort issues because you're working in darkness and you can have this enormous light pumping straight into your brain from your monitor. But B, you're also going to perceive your images as much brighter than they are. If you have a high luminance figure there. So you're going to have to bring that luminance right down, and you might go as low as in sort of 60, 70 candelas. But I will say working in a really dark or pitch black environment tends to invite more problems in general, and I don't recommend it. You should have a moderate amount of ambient light and so on. So a reasonable, reasonably lit environment. Something like you can see in my office at the moment is a pretty typical thing, or Jenny's for that matter. Reasonable light. On the flip side, if you like to work in a really bright environment, your room is flooded with natural light, you might need a higher figure there. But in reality, I would say at least 9 out of 10 of the people that we deal with would use a figure between 80 and 120 candelas in practice. For those of you who have visited our office, we use 90 candelas by default here, and that is a very effective figure. So it's normally going to be in that range. Just by the way, it's worth stopping for a moment and pointing out that everything that I'm going through in this, this talk is repeated and in much greater detail in our guide, our online guide to calibrating BenQ SW series monitors with palette master elements. So we go through all of this stuff in detail, what these figures mean and what you might work for. So you can see the little paragraph on luminance there. If you would like to sort of repeat the content later on, but if you have specific questions, just, you know, drop me a line, give us a phone call. I'll be happy to help you with specific advice. But in general, you know, as I say, here in the office, we use 90 candelas as our brightness figure. So I will type that in there.
So Martin Lee, I'm sorry I pronounced your last name wrong. He asked, do you have any advice regarding the color temperature of the ambient light?
Well, that's a good question. Look, it's difficult. In reality, that's quite difficult to control. It really depends on the lighting that you have in your room and what you can do there. It's quite hard to get high quality color accurate globes. If, for example, you have halogen downlights, you can still buy Solux globes, which are an excellent light source. They're around 5,000 Kelvin. On the other hand, if you have fluorescent fittings, which most people don't have in their home, there are actually excellent fluorescent lights available. On the other hand, if you're stuck with tungsten or LED, it is more difficult. Tungsten in particular, it's very difficult not to buy light that's not very, very warm, a little bit more warm than we would like it to be. If you have LEDs, look, LEDs have improved a lot in recent years. The main thing to do is probably to buy the warm white versions. They have typically have a white point, you know, around the 3.5 to 4, or sort of 3,000 to 4,000 Kelvin mark for ambient lighting, which is a decent figure. Some of the cold versions, because LED is naturally a very cold light, so some of them are, you know, well into the 9,000 kelvins. They're very, very blue, and you will find that as an ambient light, it's certainly terrible for print judgment, but it's just gross and cold and so on. And personally, I don't understand how anyone has those cold LED lights in their house. They freak me out. But yeah, ideally, if setting up a modern house now, for example, I would put in LED lights, and I would aim for, I would seek out a version that has ideally a high color rendering index and a white point of around 4,000 Kelvin. And they are beginning to appear now. Okay. Gamma, I won't discuss in a great detail. Historically, you may have heard other figures other than 2.2. They are all wrong. You should use Gamma 2.2, pretty much always. If you know when not to use Gamma 2.2, you're not at this lecture because you know what you're doing anyway. The reality is L-star is a sort of technical gamma that you might use, particularly for some black and white work. And the gamma of Srgb is effectively 2.2, so I don't really know why that's a separate option there. 2.2 is the correct gamma to use in pretty much all scenarios. Moving on, black point. Now, this is one area where I have a little bit of history with BenQ. I have been begging BenQ to make some adjustments in this area for quite some time. I did get an email a couple of weeks ago from one of the BenQ, well, the main BenQ developer that I know, a lovely guy called Srgb, and he mentioned that this feature is on their list for their next software version. So I was very happy to hear that. Because I would like to see better black point control on the BenQ monitors than is currently available. At the moment, you've really got two choices. You have absolute 0 or relative. And really what they mean is give me, the bottom one, absolute 0, is give me the blackest black you can give, and don't worry too much about the accuracy of those deep shadow tones. What I really want is a deep black. For color accurate use, that is almost always an incorrect decision. You want the other option, which is relative, which says, let the back point be a little bit higher, but achieve better accuracy in those deep shadow tones. Now, a huge part of the joy of photography lies in deep shadow tones and what's going on in them. We want them to be as accurate as possible. So I think for all the people that are listening tonight, you're pretty much always going to want to use relative there, unless possibly you're doing video editing, where it's a lot more about contrast and a lot less about the real accuracy of those deep shadows. What I would really prefer to see there is a proper contrast control, where I can actually give an explicit contrast figure and say, I want this monitor after calibration to have a contrast ratio of 200:1 or 170:1. And the reason I want that to come to BenQ software is because that really helps you achieve a very, very accurate print to screen match. Because what you can do is you can create individual calibrations that reflect specifically the contrast range of the papers that you're going to print on. So you can have a fine art matte calibration, and you can have a commercial glossy calibration that are noticeably different, and that are much more accurately reflect the nature of the prints that you're actually going to be getting out. So that's an area where BenQ have some room for improvement, and it was very gratifying to hear that they've listened to that, listened to me there, and that they are planning to add that feature, and that it will actually be in the relatively short term. So Srgb, if you're out there and you're listening, please don't make a liar out of me and add that on. All right, so that is through the settings. Now, you can save these settings. I suggest that you do. For example, you'll see that I have here IS default, and if I click on those, it should load up some settings that are roughly the same as what I've been talking about here. A white point of 5800 Kelvin. Here I've gone for Adobe Rgb Primaries, I think, because I was demonstrating something. A white point of about 100. This one's actually a little bit higher than others because the monitor I'm working on actually sits right next to a window, so it's a little bit brighter here than the rest of the office. So I've gone for a slightly higher brightness figure there. Okay, what I'm going to do is move through to the next screen. Here we see we can choose the calibration slots that this is going to be loaded into. So the BenQ monitors support 3 simultaneous hardware calibrations. That is, you can load 3 in there. Now you can in fact use more than those, but then it becomes more awkward to switch between them. You have to kind of load up this software and reload the calibration. So in general, you have 3 slots that you would use, and 3 is usually plenty. You know, in practice, many people just use 1 slot, but you can, for example, as I said, you could set up a fine art print, you could set up an electronic delivery, and then you could set up a 3rd calibration, which was just, you know, very high contrast, really flashy because I want to watch movies, for example. So you've got options there, and you can load them in to the 3 slots, and then you can use BenQ's nifty little hotkey puck tool to very quickly shift between those 3 calibration targets that you've chosen. You give your profile target a name. I'm pretty sure it gives you a name that kind of summarizes your settings by default. So that's really good. And so on. I personally like to have all the settings sort of listed in the profile name, but you could give it a more human name if you like. You always want the profile installed at the system level. I don't even know why that's an option, so tick that box. In general, and I'm not going to go into this in detail here because it gets quite technical, the best type of profile that you can or that you want is a 16-bit lookup table profile. That's the most accurate type of profile, so that's the one we generally recommend. Version 2 profiles are more compatible generally with various bits of software that are out there. So particularly if you use old software, you want to use a version 2 profile. Version 4 profiles add absolutely nothing to monitor profiles, so there's not much point in them anyway. So we recommend you just always use version 2. I will say that recently, with very, very recent Macs, there have been some bug reports with version 2 profiles. So it is possible that my advice there might change going forward, that on the Mac platform specifically, you might want to use version 4 profiles. Now, the last control here is patch set size, small, medium, or large. And that basically determines how many colors the BenQ software is actually going to measure during the calibration process. I would always choose large. In practice tonight, I'm just going to use medium so that it speeds up. Now, what I'm going to do, Jenny, is I'm going to kick off this calibration process. And that would be a perfect opportunity to basically go through the question list and attend to some questions while we're running, as I presume there are a few more. So I'll get that going. I'll hit the start measurement button, and you'll see that it tells me to sort of take the little lid off my calibrator. My monitor, you can't see this obviously, but my monitor is physically leaning back about 10 or 15 degrees, which just means that the calibrator will sit nice and flush on the display. So I'll get a nice, good, clean read. One of the questions that always comes up at this point is, does it matter what your ambient light is doing? You know, do I need to calibrate at night if I work at night? Do I need to, you know, calibrate separately for night and day? In general, the answer to that, well, you certainly don't need to repeat the calibration at different times of day, because the calibrator has a little foam baffle surrounding the lens, so no ambient light is getting in there anyway. It is only reading the output of the monitor. So you can do it at any time of day that suits you. The other question of, do you need separate calibrations for day and night, is an interesting question. I'll just get this process started while we talk. It's asking me to place it in the right spot, and now I'll hit continue. Okay, whether you need separate, that really depends on how much the light varies in your working environment during night and day. In reality, if your light varies so dramatically that you do need a separate calibration for night and day, then probably what you should look at, rather than having multiple calibrations, is controlling the light in your work environment. You will not find imaging work all that easy if you have massively variable light in your environment, because it will change your perception. And even if you do have a separate calibration for day and night, there's probably indeed, you know, a whole different set of levels that you would end up needing, and it just gets awkward to work that way. So consider strongly getting better artificial light and using some blinds to control the light in your environment. All right, Jenny, question time.
Yep, so we have a question from Patrick. He asks, do these settings also apply to an ISO monitor?
Yes, look, these settings are independent really of the hardware that you're using. So if you're not using a BenQ, if you're using something else, the settings advice is really the same. The only difference is some other calibration systems do already have that contrast control that I was talking about. So ASOS does, NEC's does, but BenQ will be getting it shortly. That's about the only difference there. You would probably set an explicit contrast ratio and say, I want, say, 150:1 if you're aiming for matte fine art print, or more like 200:1 if you're aiming for general print, and unconstrained contrast if you're just setting up for general purpose image display.
We also have another question. Why does my calibration won't be able to adjust to target white balance? For instance, when I do Adobe Rgb calibration using matrix profile, it can only achieve around 7,000K when the target is 6,500K, no matter how many times I try this.
That one I'm not immediately sure about. That might imply that something else is manipulating the color on your screen, and the BenQ can't therefore do an adjustment. So one of the golden rules, look, I don't know your specific situation, and that's the sort of question that's probably best done offline, so I can get into more detail. But one of the most common problems people have with calibration is if they have previously had calibration software installed, they may have leftover software running in the background. A lot of those calibration systems have a little part of them called a LUT loader, and that basically loads the LUT into the video card, and some of those can be really stubborn to get rid of. They tend to hang around when you uninstall the software, and so very often you have to do a little bit of digging and cleansing before you start with a new calibration system. So that's one possibility that springs to mind. It could also be a fault with the calibrator is preventing it from accurately measuring the white point. There are many things. As I say, that one's probably handled offline to get into some more detail, so feel free to send me an email or give me a call tomorrow or sometime next week.
We have a question from Scott. How does calibration differ from the inbuilt monitor color modes? For video editing, could I use the Rec 709 color mode, or is it better to create a custom video editing calibration? If so, what setting would you recommend?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. Okay, so basically what you've got are presets versus calibration modes. So presets are essentially factory presets of certain popular types of figures, and they're designed largely for people who don't want to bother with calibration or who don't have a calibrator, to give them reference settings. So, if they just want a really easy way of working in Srgb, or, it's also for people who could just only occasionally work in those other spaces and want a quick way of previewing things. Presets are really useful for those. So you can just dial up a preset and you basically instantly have a factory calibrated version of those things. That being said, if you are doing professional work and given you have an option and if you own a calibrator, you definitely should calibrate because you get a better result. You get a more accurate result. You get something that compensates for the age of the monitor and is more specific to your requirements. The problem with presets is they're not adjustable. They are presets. So for example, if you wanted to work in the Rec 709 space, but you were aiming for web delivery of video, you might well find the preset Rec 709 is simply too bright because it might be tailored towards editing Rec 709 for the TV space. So not only do the calibration slots give you, well, the key thing is they give you more control and more accuracy. So the short answer is, yep, you definitely want to calibrate to your own settings. In the case of Rec 709, what settings would you use? You would use settings that reflect the output that you're aiming for, and that would vary depending on your, are you mastering for, say, TVC, so television commercial, or are you preparing video for the web? We have a whole article about various settings that you might use for various aspects. It's linked at the bottom of that BenQ calibration article that I mentioned before, so you might want to review that, or again, get in touch with me later for some more specific advice about that and your particular editing scenario.
Our next question is from Sarah. If you guys want to raise your hand, I can also unmute you so you can ask Jeremy directly. So the next question is from Sarah. Does it matter if the One Display Pro is plugged into the tower rather than the monitor. It wasn't recognized when I plugged it into the monitor, even after replugging and restarting a few times on the PV270.
Okay, yep, good question again. Look, it doesn't really matter. A USB device is a USB device, so wherever it kind of is plugged in should in theory be the same. In terms of it not being recognized when you plug it into the monitor, there can be a variety of things that can come down to a cabling issue. So you might have forgotten to plug in the USB cable that also goes into the back of the monitor if you're not using a USB-C hookup. Or it can, if you're on Windows, it can come down to some of the considerable idiosyncrasies of the Windows USB system. And that means that sometimes when you plug in a device, if it doesn't instantly kind of work with Windows, Windows then kind of remembers that it's a problem device, and it will pretty much never work in that USB, that particular USB port until you essentially reset that USB port for that device manually. It's a right pain in the butt, and that can crop up. But if you've got it to work in another USB port on your machine, that's absolutely fine. There's no problem at all using your tower or your laptop or whatever it is that you've got the monitor plugged into. You can use the USB ports on that, and that's no worries at all.
Okay. We have a question from Caleb. Is validation failure a sign of faulty monitor, faulty calibrator, or something else?
It's usually something else. Well, it's very rare that it is a faulty. It can be both of those things for sure, but it's very often not those things. It's almost always some sort of software idiosyncrasy. It's a very difficult one to actually pin down why it's failing. And it depends where the failure is. A few versions ago of BenQ software, there was a brief bug, for example, in the BenQ software where the values that the BenQ software were validating against were incorrect. So basically, there was just a mathematical error in the tables that they were using. They were incorrect, and so validation was never going to work. On the other hand, if it's failing, it usually means that there's something going on that is also altering the color. So BenQ is attempting to correct that color, but then something's interfering with that. So that goes back to doing a thorough clean out of other systems and things like that. But it can be a little bit difficult. What I'll do here, actually, just while we're on the topic, is I will kick off a validation. You can just see here the calibration results. You can see, for example, that it got very close to the target luminance and the target temperature. So everything's looking good there. And the next stage that we would normally go through is to validate the calibration. Now, normally when I do this, I'm not running screen sharing software, so I'm a little concerned that will interfere with this, and I'll be curious to see if it does or doesn't, but that's classically the type of software that can get in the way of color accurate display, and you normally wouldn't be running it while you're working, so it's not normally a problem, but it's the sort of thing that might interfere with validation. But we'll see in a minute. I will say, BenQ are very courageous putting the validation thing right there for a couple of reasons. One, it's tricky because there are so many possible settings that you can calibrate to. Doing validation against all the possible calibration settings that people have chosen is actually really quite difficult to do because you have to adjust the values for all those possible calibrations. So sorry, I need to click continue there. That's actually quite difficult for BenQ to really pull off. The values that you're when a monitor fails validation, people get very scared. Very often, it's failing it by the tiniest margin, and that's because the BenQ values in that area are really quite stringent. And if it's just outside of those values, it does not mean that your display is awful or unworkable or that you're not color accurate and so on. It means that there is a very slight amount of error that is beyond the ideal parameters. It doesn't necessarily mean a disaster. But again, that's a kind of case-by-case thing. And it can be quite difficult to diagnose, but I'm happy to take it up with you offline if you're having that problem. If you'd like to see here, though, you can see this is the sort of classic results that you tend to get with a BenQ. And I should just point out, you know, the BenQ monitors that I'm using here, they're not cherry-picked examples that are better than the ones that, that we sell or that people have on their desks at home. You know, it's just a random unit. I have never had a BenQ monitor fail validation in the many, many times I have calibrated it. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that I am absolutely ruthless about cleaning other calibration and color affecting software off those machines before I start, and that's why all our calibration guides emphasize that really strongly right up front. But you can see here these results are excellent. You know, all of these values are well below the, well, in this case, well below even the minimum threshold of 2, and certainly way below the maximum threshold of 4. So we had no trouble at all calibrating, even though we're sharing screens and so on. So that's a really good result. When we're done, we just hit finish. That is saved into the monitor, and it will automatically install that profile that we were talking about earlier. And there's really nothing more I need to do. I can fire up my software and I will be working on a glorious color accurate screen. So that's a basic run through. Hopefully that has been useful, and probably, yeah, for the rest of the time here, we've got another 10 minutes or so. I'm just quite happy to finish off with questions.
Yeah,
I might stop sharing my screen at this point if that's, yep. Okay, so just so I can see what's going on a bit better.
So we have a question from Stan. He said, thanks for answering the ICC profile question. So if I have 3 calibration, do I need to manually select a different ICC profile each time I switch the mode?
Yeah, again, that's a good question. Again, because that profile is essentially a null profile, no, you don't. Now, if it is absolutely and categorically truly doing nothing, that I cannot, you know, sign on the dotted line and promise you and so on. So the purist in me says it's a good idea to just change the profile just in case. But really, in practice, I don't know if anyone does actually change that profile, because essentially it is a null profile. It's not doing anything. So it doesn't really matter. It will create one no matter how many times you calibrate. It will always create a matching ICC profile. But because they're all the same and not doing anything, it really doesn't matter. You don't have to manually choose that one. All you really need to do is change the which calibration mode you're doing, either through the hotkey puck or the controls on the monitor, and away you go. But you do need to, again, technically you don't, this is old advice, you don't really need to restart your software either. But again, the purist in me, as a defensive thing, I will always, if I change the calibration on any monitor, I will always restart my software just to make sure it is picking up the newest changes, although in reality with hardware calibration that is again technically not necessary. I guess it's almost like throwing salt over your shoulder. It's almost superstitious at this point, but yeah.
We have a question from Jojo. She said that she's running multiple monitors from her laptop through a Thunderbolt, but she can't seem to calibrate her IPS panel. It just keeps adjusting her laptop screen.
Well, that will come down to the specifics of what you're using. In theory, it should be fine to calibrate external monitors. Certainly, it's no problem in general. Say if you have a MacBook and a BenQ external monitor, that is, you know, people do that all over the world all day, every day. So that there's no general issue there. That said, some calibration systems, more limited ones, if you're not using a hardware calibration system, but more limited ones don't allow multiple monitor calibration. So they will only calibrate the primary monitor, in which case you can get it to calibrate the external one by designating, even if it's only temporarily, the external monitor as you would designate the external monitor as the primary monitor, even temporarily, and then it would allow it to calibrate it. But that is a kind of, quite specific question depending on what calibration, what calibrator, and what monitors you're actually using.
Our next question is from Scott. My primary monitor is an SW271. My second monitor is a PA272W.
Yep, that's an NEC model. Yeah.
What is the best software process to use to maintain calibration of both monitors? Is DisplayCal a good choice for the PA272W?
Yes and no. I mean, in an ideal world, you would use BenQ's hardware calibration software with the BenQ, and you would use NEC SpectraView 2, which is their version of the same thing for the NEC monitor. Unfortunately, NEC always charged extra for that software, which I always thought was particularly mean on their part. That would be the perfect thing to do. You would use the hardware calibration system with both. On the other hand, I could understand why you might want to calibrate them both the same way, in which case, yep, DisplayCal would be a nice choice. But even though DisplayCal is an excellent piece of software, it does not have direct hardware access, I'm pretty sure, to either of those monitors, so you wouldn't really be using them to their full potential if you went down that path. You'd only really be using software calibration. Now, both of those are monitors, they're excellent monitors, so you would still get excellent results from them, but it would not be the ideal process with either one.
Justin asks, any reason why Palette Master will not allow me to proceed on first screen after selecting the calibrator? Could it be from other calibration software being installed?
Possibly. If it's detecting your monitor and detecting the calibrator, I've never known it not to continue from there. So that one would be odd, I've got to say. I've never known, if it has detected those things successfully, it's fine. Usually it won't let you proceed if it has failed to detect one of those two things. It must detect that you're using a compatible monitor, a BenQ monitor, and to do that, it needs the USB cable plugged in. That might be the USB-C cable that you're using for video, or if you're using something like a DisplayPort cable, then you need the extra USB cable plugged in. But if they're both being identified by the SW software and it's not then letting you proceed, I would say that's a weird bug and worth raising with someone, whoever you bought it from, either us or with BenQ themselves. Yeah, but one of the, I can see Ivy answering a question there. One of the important things to understand is there is general purpose calibration software, and then there is very specific calibration software. So BenQ's software can really only be used with BenQ's monitors, in the same way that ASO's software can only be used with ASO's, and NEC's can only be used with NEC's. Those direct hardware calibration systems are very vendor specific. If you are doing software calibration, on the other hand, you can use, say, Iowan Profiler that comes with the Iowan Display Pro Calibrator. You can use that with any monitor. But again, you're not then taking advantage of the nice hardware you've got. And so on. Or DisplayCal is an excellent piece of open source software that's compatible with just about everything, but it is only software calibration.
We have a question from Martin. He goes, my prints are continuously too dark. Is it correct to adjust the luminance of the monitor to resolve this?
Yes, absolutely it is. We have an article on our website called, what is it called? I think it's My Prints Are Too Dark. And that is quite, oh God, I've gone all, anyway, I won't look it up now, but it's called My Prints Are Too Dark, and it refers to what is quite simply the #1 problem in digital imaging, which is that almost everybody's monitors are far too bright for print work. So yes, absolutely adjust the luminance on your monitor, and oh look, Jenny, you're fast, aren't you? Well done. That is the article I'm talking about, and basically what you do is you recalibrate to a lower luminance level. So if you're currently, calibrating to 100, or not calibrating, whatever it is, recalibrate down to 90 or 80 until such time as your perception of your prints matches your perception of your monitor, remembering that you must look at the two separately. You must look at the print under a decent print viewing light separately to looking at the image on your monitor, and give your eye just a moment to adjust between the two scenarios, because a backlit image and a print held side by side will just never match, because your eye cannot deal with a light transmissive, so a light emitting device like a monitor, and a flat light reflecting object like a print at the same time. That is just a fundamental property of the human eye and physics, and you can't fight it.
Okay, we have a question. We're just going to wrap it up. We've got 2 more questions. So what's the difference between Cal 1, Cal 2, and Custom 1 and Custom 2?
That's a good question. Not actually sure I know, in the sense that Cal 1 and Cal 2 are the calibration modes, and they're the ones I would always use. The Custom 1 and Custom 2, I think, are basically just places you can store settings and whatnot, but they're not fully calibratable modes, so they don't have lookup table calibrations stored in them. I'm pretty sure that's the case, but I'll be perfectly honest, I only ever use the cal modes or very occasionally a preset if I want to do something quickly. I don't actually use the custom modes, so that might be a better one for BenQ, but I'm pretty confident that what they are is sort of a way of creating your own preset. So they're much like a preset. You can put some settings in there and it will remember those settings, but you won't have the full benefit of a calibration stored in your lookup tables. And lucky last.
Does Palette Master work with SW240 and i1 Studio?
It works with the SW240. By i1 Studio, I presume you mean so there's more than one. I hate the X-Rite naming. The i1 Studio, if you're talking about the print and monitor calibrator, i1 Studio, that costs in this country, it costs about $750. Yes, that will work with Palette Master elements. If you're talking about the X-Rite i1 Display Studio, which is the kind of cut down X-Rite i1 display unit, that will not work with Palette Master elements. So without being very specific on your naming, yes, it will work on the print calibration one, and no, it will not work with the cut down monitor calibrator. Just to repeat, I'm really happy to answer these questions. A big part of my life is answering people's calibration questions, so feel free to contact me offline. There is a contact form on the website. You know, as long as you don't completely, send me 50 different questions, I'm happy. It doesn't matter if you're a customer of ours or whatever, I'm quite happy to answer your questions. Please do send me as much specific detail about your hardware and what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve as you can, because if you just send me a question going, my monitor's too pink, what can I do? That doesn't give me a lot to work with. So if you can be specific, that would be great, but feel free to send me questions. I'll be happy to answer even. Shall we wrap it up there, Jenny?
Yep, sounds good. Thank you again, Jeremy, and everyone for attending the webinar. If you have any questions, you can always give the amazing Jeremy from Image Science a call. Or just... Yep.
Can I just interrupt one question? Because I see one little question go past, and it's to, my camera takes photos using Srgb. Will the photos look the same whether I use Adobe Srgb or Srgb on my monitor? The answer to that is in a way actually yes, Ivy. Sorry to disagree. The thing is, if you're in a color managed application and you open an Srgb image up from your camera, it won't matter whether your monitor is in really Srgb or Adobe RGB, because that application knows what the image should look like. It will then open it up and it will display the Srgb image as Srgb, even though the monitor is set to Adobe RGB. It has the potential to display more color than that, but if the actual image doesn't contain it, it won't go ahead and oversaturate your image. It will show you the Srgb image correctly. So sorry, I didn't mean to step on your feet there, Ivy, but I thought I might correct you on that one as I saw it go past. Hi, Wayne, good to hear from you. And yes, your SW321C is not very far away at all now, and we will let you know the moment it comes in.
Thank you so much, guys. Have a good night. Enjoy dinner.
No worries.
Thanks again, Jeremy. Bye.
Hope everyone enjoyed it. Nice to see so many of our customers there.